Okay, hi, and welcome to Climate Change Part 2. This is about the impacts of climate change. So let's just get started straight away. Essentially, the impacts are global and local, and you'd be wise to kind of see it in those terms. The first one that talk about is sea level rise. It First of all, when ice melts in water, it does not change the level of water. So make sure you understand that. You need to talk about ice on land melting and adding its water supply to the oceans. But sea level rise is really not only a product of ice on land flowing into the ocean, but also because of a product of something called thermal expansion, whereby when liquids get warmer, they expand in size. And that is causing to the rise of sea level. A proper explanation of this is really what I would want to see if I was marking your work. So make sure that you take on board the duality of the ice on land melting and sea level rise through thermal expansion. Another impact of climate change, which is talked about a lot, is increased levels of precipitation or drought. Having some case study examples of this is really important. And there's been recently a lot of coverage over the last year or two in the USA, where many of their reservoirs, you can see a comparative photo on the screen in front of you, have been drying out. UN estimates that 8% of the world population could experience water shortage by 2100 is a good little way for you to back yourself up there. Having a bit of case study detail, I think, is important because otherwise you're going to be quite limited in the commentary you're offering here. Otherwise, really what you're saying here is that climate change causes increased levels of rainfall. And putting it like that, you can see why I wouldn't give you marks for that. That links, though, to more extreme and more variable weather, including floods, droughts, hurricanes, tornadoes, etc. Wildfires are another feature that we might talk about that here. And the fact that we now refer to a storm season in Western Europe is, I think, evident. It could be referred to as evidence for that. You've then got coastal inundation or flooding of low-lying areas. Having a case study of this is really important. Otherwise, as I've said before, your commentary is just going to be a bit limited. Bangladesh is a particularly good one. Bangladesh is low-lying. Bangladesh being here in Southeast Asia, or Southern Asia. And the point you can make here is not only are low-lying coastal areas like Bangladesh going to flood, that's potentially straight away marks for you, but that is going to go on to lead to the large-scale displacement of people and land loss and farming land loss and food supply in that region. And that will go on to spark potentially a geopolitical disaster through the mass migration of refugees from a flooded area. I'm not going to get into a lecture here on the geopolitics of Southern Asia, fascinating though it is, but the mass migration of millions of people out of Bangladesh into neighbouring countries is potentially a disaster waiting to happen. And you could manufacture a really convincing, well-researched paragraph of writing there with good real-world examples. A good separate example, you'll notice here how I'm trying to keep my themes quite separate from each other. Otherwise, it can be quite tempting to kind of merge all of this together into a rather difficult to mark woolly essay. Try and keep your points distinct so it's easier for your marker. An increase in extent of vector-borne disease. A vector is the thing that does the transmission of a disease. And in the case of a disease called malaria, that is a mosquito. And the mosquitoes that carry malaria only exist within certain zones of temperature. And those temperature zones are becoming more widespread. And so malarial mosquitoes are spreading more widely across the world. A case study example of that is now that malarial mosquitoes have been found in southern Europe, and that is, of course, of concern to anyone living in those areas. Malaria being a killer disease if not treated. There are positives to climate change, and I think that's an important thing to include within your answer. I can easily see a scenario in which you might be asked, for positive and negative impacts of climate change. So having a few positives up your sleeve is good. And that's that some areas specifically Russia was a very good example, are actually gaining in the length of their growing seasons. And that's because they are, on average, getting warmer. So areas where wheat can be grown, for example, are increasing in certain economies. And it is, I suppose, one could put it in, you could put it in a certain way, which is in their interests for the globe to get warmer. Another argument you could make here is the sea passage over the north of Russia, which is melting and becoming increasingly navigable. If the ice was to retreat off the entirety of the northern coastline of Russia, then there would be a new sea passage route navigable from Asia to Europe. And that would reduce the need for the sea passage that goes through the Suez Canal. And that would have profound and pretty massive economic impacts upon the economies in the Mediterranean and upon those trade routes. So there's quite a lot to talk about there, but the basic point here is that there will be lower growing seasons in growing seasons in many areas. Again, talking about these things though with a bit of understanding, you can actually package these into little mini paragraphs which will win you multiple marks. I've left it till late on in this presentation to even mention polar bears. Habitat loss is a major product of climate change. It's estimated that there's going to be a 10% extinction rate for land-based species. If you are determined to talk about polar bears, make sure you do it right. Polar bears are dying out because they are losing their hunting habitat. They hunt seals that are born on floating bergs of ice. As the ice becomes less reliable and melts faster, there's less habitat for the seals to be born on. It becomes harder for the polar bears then to sneak up, basically, and hunt those seals that use the floating bits of ice as a kind of nursery to grow up on. So the point you want to make is that polar bears are losing their hunting habitat. That's why they are in danger. Simply saying that polar bears need ice and that the ice is melting means that polar bears will die is not going to get you marks. Again, keeping the themes different, we've got sea temperatures. As the sea's temperatures warm, they absorb more carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide, when mixed with water, makes water more acidic, and that causes corals to be bleached. I would really want you to give that level of explanation when talking about coral bleaching. Extended periods of bleaching can kill the coral, and that then has you're killing an entire ecosystem, and then that has a massive impact upon other marine life in that food chain. Would be an extended mark that you could go on to talk about. But make sure you get your understanding of coral bleaching correct. It's the idea that the oceans are becoming more acidic as they absorb more CO2. Now we're talking about oceans, it's useful to talk about changes to ocean currents. Ocean currents, like the North Atlantic Drift, bring warm water to Britain. They bring unseasonably warm water to Britain, in fact, and there's an argument to be made that the climate of Britain is uncharacteristically warm for its latitude. Compare Britain's latitude to other countries at similar latitudes, and then compare their average winter temperatures, and you'll see that there are some stark differences. We cannot predict how global warming with the melting of the ice on Greenland, how that melted ice is going to impact upon the circulatory system of the ocean currents in the North Atlantic. If the North Atlantic Drift, the North Atlantic current changes direction because it's suddenly got colder due to melting ice on Greenland, that can have a very profound impact upon the British climate. And that would, of course, impact our everything from our transport infrastructure to our ability to farm and heat our homes. Sticking with the oceanic theme, changes in atmospheric circulation patterns. For example, you could talk about El Nino here and La Nina. It depends on what your teachers taught you. I kind of go with the Indian Ocean Dipole as a slightly simpler model of that case study. What happens here is that in the Indian Ocean there is a cool side of the Indian Ocean and a warm side of the Indian Ocean, and that sets up a circulatory system of the ocean currents. On the warm side, that leads to more evaporation and more cloud formation. On the cool side, less evaporation and less cloud formation. That tends to mean that East Africa gets more rainfall and West Australia tends to be drier. However, with the exaggerating effect of climate change, that means that the west side of the Indian Ocean gets warmer than usual, and as a corollary, that means as an impact of that, the east side of the Indian Ocean gets cooler than normal. That results in the clouds that form in the west becoming more exaggerated and East Africa receiving floods. And in Western Australia, this reduces their rain chances even further and leads to drought and wildfire conditions. It's a little bit complex, but if you can get your head around it, there's actually quite a few marks to score in there. And it's a really good case study, and a relevant and up-to-date one too. And lastly, of course, it's going to, in some areas, for example in Scotland, we're predicted less snow, and this is going to impact on things like our skiing industry. So there's a quick rundown of impacts of climate change. I should really point out that there are many, many, many more. It just depends what your teacher teaches you. Please don't feel that this is an exclusive list. And I would suggest that the best way to revise this is at a personal interest level. Prioritize your notes into an order which you find to be most interesting to you. You'll, I'm sure, be more interested in some of these case studies than others. Another top tip is to try and keep them thematically separate, using small bullet-pointed paragraphs to develop the ocean theme, to develop the changes in rainfall theme of your answer. It's going to be a good way to keep your head straight in exam conditions and not to lose the thread of what you're saying. Okay, I hope you found that helpful as a quick guide to the impacts of climate change.